Good morning. As is my practice, I'll just wait a few moments. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Good morning. It is May the 4th, 2022. I know that because my children went to school wearing their Star Wars t-shirts today. So it is May the 4th, happy the 4th. I'm Hearing Officer Nicole Kinsey with the Administrative Hearings Office of the State Water Resources Control Board. We are conducting Phase 1B of the hearing in the Kern River applications matter. This is day 3 of our hearing process so far. This hearing is being conducted by Zoom web conference and is also being broadcast live on the AHO YouTube channel. Both the audio and video are being recorded. We will post files of those recordings and the Zoom generated transcript to the AHO FTP site. The YouTube recording will also be available on the AHO YouTube webpage. And if you are experiencing technical difficulties today trying to communicate with us, please send us an email at admin@waterboards.ca.gov. The AHO staff will be monitoring that email inbox and can alert me to your difficulties. Assisting me today, as has been the case the last 2 days, are several staff from the AHO. We have Nicole Mullen, Amy Blunk, Skylar Anderson, and Kyle Woldridge. And Nicole Mullen, as you know, does a wonderful job. I think Kyle takes responsibility, Mr. Woldridge, I'll say, responsibility for pinning us up on the screen. So he's to thank for having our appropriate screenshots on the YouTube and the Zoom. So there you have it. Ms. Mullen will be handling the screen sharing, as has been the case, of the exhibits and moving them along the slides. If you are a witness today, you may ask Ms. Mullen to advance to the next slide when you are ready during your testimony. And attorneys, as has been the practice, you may ask Ms. Mullen directly to bring up a particular exhibit. If at any time I am experiencing technical difficulties, which happens, it happened to us yesterday, and if I'm not able to rejoin the Zoom conference within a few moments, one of my staff will call a brief recess until I am able to rejoin you. We will take breaks today, as has been our habit. Please let me know if you need a break. Witnesses, please let me know if you need a break. But I will plan to take them every hour or hour to 90 minutes. We will take at least an hour for lunch, and we will have a hard stop at 5 p.m. I will roll over the appearances from yesterday, which was from the day before, so from Monday, May 2nd. But before I move on, is there anyone who has not, other than our witnesses, who has not had a chance to introduce themselves, who will be joining us today? All right, I think where we left things off yesterday was Mr. Becerra had completed his cross-examination of Dr. Davids. And I was, at that point, would move on to asking whether other parties would like to cross-examine Dr. Davids. But before we step straight into that, I will take a brief pause to see if there are any procedural matters that we should address before we get started. All right, with that, I will look to the room. Maybe I'll start with Mr. Jacobs. Do you have any cross-exam questions for Dr. Davids?
I do, thank you.
Would you be prepared to start us off this morning?
Yes, I'm ready to go. And I don't have nearly as many as yesterday, so.
Okay, good to know. And our view is changing, so I'm looking to see Dr. Davids pop up on my screen here. There we go. There we have it. Good. I just wanted to say good morning, Dr. Davids. Thank you for joining us again. I know it was a long day yesterday, and here we are again, but I appreciate you being here. And with that, the witness is already sworn in. So Mr. Jacobs, please take it away.
Great. Good morning, Dr. Davids. I just have a few questions for you. Ms. Mullen, could you please pull up KWBA 133?
And while that's being pulled up, I'll also return the good morning since I didn't get a chance. Ms. Kinsey and Mr. Jacobs, good morning.
Okay. So yesterday we spent some time going over this exhibit KWBA 133. And as I understand it, this exhibit depicts a linear regression demonstrating alfalfa production in Kern County going back to the 1800s. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And am I also correct in understanding that the linear regression for alfalfa production is shown by that blue dotted line?
Could you be more specific, or I guess I would like to clarify what the blue dotted line is. If I
Okay. Well, I see a red hatched line and I see a blue dotted line. The linear regression that you prepared is depicted by the blue dotted line, correct?
Well, both of those lines are actually linear regressions, just different methodologies for developing them.
Okay.
And if we want to review that, I'd be happy to review those.
No, that makes sense. As I understand it, you created these linear regressions with several data points, correct?
That is correct.
And how many data points did you use to create these linear regressions?
Yeah, and so that's the distinction between the two different lines that we see. So let's start with the blue dashed line, and then I'll move to the red dashed line. The blue dashed line is based on, and I'll count them, it's from 1990, moving backwards in time. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I think it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 data points for the blue dashed line.
And for the red dashed line?
So the methodology for the red dashed line is different, as I had mentioned, and let me just step through that. So we have the orange triangle at 1990. The orange triangle is an average, is a kind of a 10-year window average. So it includes 1985, 1990, and 1995. And the average of those three yields are shown by the vertical location of the orange triangle. And then the green circle at 1960 is also itself a 3-year average of the 1955, 1960, and 1965 data points.
How many data points are necessary to create an accurate linear regression?
Well, it's an important question, and I think accurate is a relative term, and it depends on the questions that you're asking and what confidence level you'd like to set. What I'll point out about the blue dashed line is that there's the necessary statistics to interpret the strength of that regression. There's a statistic, if we look down in the legend, the third entry from the bottom of the legend states that the R squared, that's the coefficient of determination, is the statistical term for R squared, is equal to 0.41. And if you take the square root of that, you end up with what's called the Pearson's correlation coefficient, or R value. And there's critical R values that are dependent on the sample size. And if I recall correctly, in my testimony, I present what the critical value was, and the fact that our correlation coefficient is actually above the critical value, meaning that it's statistically significant using best statistical practices.
Okay. I'm not sure you answered my question, though. My question was about how many data points are necessary to derive an accurate linear regression.
And of course, these conversations are always tricky because I cannot answer that question directly. I tried to provide some additional background to what makes a sufficient number of data points, and essentially what this gets down to is what's called the correlation coefficient, and then the critical value of that correlation coefficient based on the number of samples that you're using for the regression. There's no straight answer, unfortunately, Mr. Jacobs. In general, more data is better, but of course we have the data that we have, and again, engineering is making adequate assumptions from inadequate information. So I think you can appreciate that.
Yeah. Is there a rule that you follow when you determine how many data points to use?
Well, I think we should use as much data as we can, as much data as available, of course, notwithstanding the important piece of validating a regression that you develop from the data.
Is there a number of data points that would be too few to draw an accurate linear regression?
Well, from a geometric perspective, the minimum number of points is 2, and I can explain the red dashed line in greater detail, and the fact that it's conservatively higher in terms of its yield productions than the actual linear regression based on all 8 data points of data that we have from 1990 through 1955.
Is there a rule that you would follow where you would this would be too few data points to present a linear regression as being an accurate depiction?
Well, again, I think this gets back, Mr. Jacobs, to the statistics and the sense of what the correlation coefficient is, and how that compares to the critical values based on the table of what is called as the Pearson correlation coefficient. This is a statistical measure for understanding the strength of a linear regression, and it's a function of the sample size. Unfortunately, I don't have as an exhibit a Pearson correlation coefficient table. I'd love to pull one up and discuss it with you. But again, the strength of a linear regression is a function of the number of samples and the scatter of those samples about your regression. So there's no direct answer, I'm afraid, to your question, Mr. Jacobs.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. It took me a while to get to my unmute button. I will look out to the room, which is a little bit obscured in my view here. Here we have a gallery. Is there anyone else who would like to cross-examine Dr. David this morning?
Steve, this is Jennifer Spoletta for Rosedale, and I would like to ask a few questions.
All right, thank you. Please proceed, Ms. Spoletta.
Good morning, Mr. Davids. How are you?
Good morning, Ms. Spoletta. I'm doing well. I'm appreciating the view that I have right now. I hope you are also doing well.
All right, so I just have a couple of questions for you this morning. First of all, Mr. Jacobs asked you a little bit about the regression analysis for the alfalfa yield. Can you just explain to me in very basic terms, as a practical matter, what impact that analysis had on your estimate of the total diversion of water in Buena Vista over time?
Yes. I will do my best. I'll say that I've been confused by listening to lawyers speak for most of my life. So I think this is sort of some sort of poetic justice to speak now and confuse a bunch of lawyers. So I apologize. It's certainly not my intent, and I'll speak as clearly as I can. But I think what would be helpful, Ms. Spoletta, would be to look at a slide from my presentation. So Ms. Mullen, I'm wondering if you could pull up, let's see, give me a moment to make sure. It's the watershed schematic. I think it's slide 10 from KWBA 148. Great, you are incredibly fast. Thank you very much. So just to place this in context, the yield adjustments, or rather the KC, or the crop coefficient adjustments, that we're talking about based on yield data are that rectangle that's kind of right in the middle of our screen. So it's the third row and the third column from the left. Now, the context is we have these crop coefficients, right? The crop coefficient is KC. And if we look up at, I'm going to move one row over to the left and then one column to the left and one row up to that box that says estimated maximum crop evapotranspiration. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. So parenthetically, below that statement, there's a simple equation that says the ETC, that's the evapotranspiration of a crop, is equal to the product of ETO, which is reference ET, and then times that crop coefficient.
So I think I might be able to make this shorter for you.
Yes.
If I'm understanding correctly, there is a relatively standard crop coefficient for alfalfa, and you just adjusted it to be more reflective of the Kern County area based on actual yield data from Kern County. Is that correct?
Objection, vague and ambiguous as to Kern County area.
Ms. Valletta, would you care to be more specific about Kern County area?
Sure. Well, I'll ask Dr. Davids, did you simply take a standard crop coefficient for alfalfa and make an adjustment to it that's reflective of a particular geographic area?
Could you repeat the question, Ms. Valletta? Thank you.
Sure. I just was trying to make it a little shorter, but maybe I'm making it longer.
I was about to land the plane, but I think it's necessary to get the right context in terms of the mathematical formulation to be able to answer the question. So
right. Well, I think what you did, and I just am trying to confirm that this is what you did, is that you took a standard crop coefficient for alfalfa and you made an adjustment to it to be more reflective of a particular geographic area.
I'm going to say that really the nature of this discussion about yield has more to do with an adjustment in time than an adjustment in space.
I see.
Hopefully that's clear.
That actually is very helpful because the crop coefficients that you're using were developed in modern times, but you had to adjust them for historical yield data. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. So if I'm understanding correctly, because yields of alfalfa have increased significantly, I would say over time, if you used today's crop coefficient for alfalfa, it would overstate water use in the past when yields per acre of alfalfa were generally less. Is that right?
Objection, misstates prior testimony. Dr. Davids acknowledged yesterday he did not use crop yield data from the 1930s that were available from the Stanton report.
I'm trying to think of a good way to cut through this because I think Ms. Valletta's questions, I'll overrule the objection, but Dr. Davids, please correct Ms. Valletta. You've done a very good job of being very clear in your answers. And I think this is we're just trying to get to the bottom of this. And I don't understand Ms. Valletta's question to be an attempt to confuse the matter. So Dr. Davids, if you would please answer, if you remember the question, and characterize as you have very carefully.
Yes. And I think I was perhaps a bit thrown off by the objection. So Ms. Valletta, would you mind stating your question?
Sure. So my understanding is that alfalfa yields per acre have generally increased over time, and therefore the water use per acre of alfalfa has also increased over time. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So the crop coefficient for alfalfa that you have reflects current yields and current water use. Is that correct?
Objection, misstates prior testimony. I believe the crop coefficient is consistent over time. It's the evapotranspiration from the crop that differs, I believe.
Dr. Davids, will you clarify for both of us. What the,
I
respond
would
to the
be-
question or Mr. Becerra's characterization. This is, I realize this is not normal questioning, but do your best.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to. I think if I can get sort of a somewhat of an uninterrupted moment to speak, I think we can probably get through this. The adjustment, to be very clear, was to the crop coefficient. But if we look at the equation that I was directing our attention to, which is the FAO 56 formulation of ETC equals ETO times KC, any adjustment you make to KC has a linear impact on ETC, right? I think we can see that if you made KC half of what it was, why then ETC would also become half of what it was. So that's a linear equation, right? What Ms. Valletta said, I think very nicely characterized exactly the point. And this is that forage crops like alfalfa, where all of the biomass produced by that crop is actually considered part of the yield. And mind you that alfalfa was the primary crop, as we've seen from Dr. Miltenberger's work and also from my slides yesterday during the circa 1914 period. Alfalfa being a forage crop, if there is less yield, then there is less water consumption. That's a well-established fact dating all the way back into the late 1910s and well-established up through modern day science, that there's this linear, well-developed relationship between the yield of forage crops and the consumption of the water associated with those crops. I hope does that clarify, Ms. Valletta, the question there?
It does. I was just trying to understand the practical purpose of the adjustment, and I think I do understand it now. Thank you.
Excellent. And if I could clarify one thing that you said, Ms. Valletta, was about the crop coefficient being sort of a regional value, and what I was trying to do was kind of make that more geographically specific. What I would like to clarify is that the crop coefficients that were analyzed from the remotely sensed data were specific to the Buena Vista Water Storage District for the period from 2016 through 2019, implicit in that pixel by pixel data that we have from that data set. So there was both in the present a very geographic tying of the data to the Buena Vista Water Storage District, and then in terms of the regression back in time, there was a validation with direct references to crop yields circa 1914 from the Barnes report that we looked at yesterday.
Thank you. Okay, now I noticed in a couple places in your testimony that you used the term upper end as far as your estimates. And I wanted to just again have a practical understanding. When you say that your estimates are at the upper end, what were you intending to mean by that phrase?
Yes, thank you. And Ms. Mullen, I think we could probably remove this slide. I'm not sure if it's going to be helpful for this particular discussion, and maybe it'd be better to be able to see the people. There we go. Thank you. I believe the exact language is upper range, but it really has the same connotation as upper end. Maybe there's kind of interchangeability between those two statements, but the sense that that these estimates are upper range or upper end is that Ms. Valletta, that there was a series of conservative estimates that together culminate to form together culminate to these values being really considered like an upper bookend of what likely happened. And let me just review a couple of those assumptions. So number one would be that there were adequate water supplies in the Kern River system to meet the full extent of crop water requirements. And I think what we know from Dr. Miltenberger's characterization of the Kern River as capricious, that actually just sometimes is not the case. There are times where there's insufficient water available. And so in that sense, that's one assumption, one of the main assumptions that would lead to this being an upper threshold of crop water demands. And likely the actual value would be below this value. And I can go through other examples of the conservative assumptions that lead to that upper end, but hopefully that adds some specificity.
So my understanding is that you took your assumptions based on acres, crops, and you said, I'm going to assume that of these acres and these crops, every single acre of the crop receives the yield, the full yield, and receives the full water supply for the full growing season.
I think that's, if I could just try to restate that, I think that's generally correct. Even the acreage values themselves, though, were really, higher acreage, the higher of the acreage references. If we had, two references, that maybe had some conflict, I would, working with Dr. Miltenberger, is always the higher, acreage value that was used just to be conservatively high. And then on that acreage, like you mentioned, the requirement of that crop in terms of its water requirements would have been fully met. So essentially the term would be that the crop would not be stressed during its maturity and photosynthetic process. And so in that sense, it's in the upper end.
Okay, so for the time period of your evaluation, which was 135 years, you did not make any reductions for things like not harvesting or irrigating because of market conditions, disease, a crop being taken out by weather, no reductions for anything like that.
Objection, compound.
It is technically compound, so I'll sustain the objection, but Ms. Valletta, I think you can.
Sure. During the 135-year history, you did not make any reductions in water use as a result of disease.
That is correct.
And you also didn't make any reductions in water use as a result of market conditions.
Let me just nuance that. The reported acreages by, for example, the District Securities Commission would likely reflect global or regional market conditions that would reduce the acreage. And so in that sense, there was an accounting for a reduction in acreage as reported by the historical materials. But in the sense of whatever acreage was actually planted being reduced because perhaps the market for cotton fell out, and so they just sort of let the crop die and stopped irrigating it, that would not be reflected in my analysis.
And you did not make any reductions in water use as a result of damage to crops from weather.
That is correct.
Okay, then I have a couple of questions for you about seepage, your seepage calculations. And I'm going to try to keep these extremely high level, but my understanding is that you analyzed seepage in the Buena Vista system, and I'm trying to understand where in the distribution system that analysis started, like the physical location of where it started and where it ended. And
Okay.
I don't know if it's helpful for you to look at a map, but I just wanted to make sure that I had in my mind the visual of where that analysis stopped and started.
Yes.
Started and stopped.
Yes, very good, very good. And I was hoping to get a
Objection, there's no question pending.
Okay, so let's start with the question. Which map would be easiest to use to answer my questions about where the seepage analysis starts and stops?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Valletta. There's two figures that will be helpful to review. The first one, if we could, Ms. Moll, if we could pull up the KWBA 148 and then turn to slide 4. And the first one that we'll look at is a schematic. So it's not geographically explicit, but I hope that it will help. And then we'll move to an actual map that sort of puts each of these arrows on the map. So let's just walk through this. If you look at the tables, and I'm not going to turn there now, but there were two tables that summarize the seepage analysis, two exhibits. Yes. I think you know the ones that I'm referring to. There's a mention of the channel number, and also those are all numbers. And so if we look on this schematic, the conveyance facilities are represented by these gray arrows, and they're labeled 1 through 6. So do you see that?
Yes.
So each of those channels are the channels that these seepage estimates were made for.
I see.
And each of the areas that those conveyance channels move water from or to is listed with a letter parenthetically, so A, B, and so forth. So for example, to move water from A to B, or Kern River at second point to the confluence of Kern River and Buena Vista Slough, facility 1 would have to be used, conveyance facility 1, that is the Kern River channel between those 2 points. So if we could now move to a map figure, and just to use this as an example of geographically where that is actually, physically represented. Would that be helpful?
Well, I think, yeah, if we just move to the next slide in the presentation, it would be 148-005.
Yeah, and we can use this one. I don't have the line work on this one. If we wanted, we could move to, well, this is fine. Let's just stay here. So Ms. Mullen, would you mind zooming in to where it says second point, just to make that a little bit larger? I'd still like to see Buena Vista Lake, or at least the top part of Buena Vista Lake, and then I'd like to see the start of the east and west canals up to the top left. So if you could kind of move up to the north and west, which would be kind of up and to the left. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so we can see second point there. And we can also see, this is William Hammond Hall's map. We can see that the main channel of the Kern River is listed as such. It says main channel between second point and the confluence with Buena Vista Slough. Do you see that?
I see.
Okay, so that the conveyance channel 1 would be that exact reach of conveyance from second point down to that confluence. So that would be 1. And then we can go through the rest of the numbers if it's helpful, but that's 1.
No, I think I understand. So I just want to make sure I understand where the seepage is going. Is it correct that all the seepage through these various channels is going into the Kern subbasin?
I do not know the western boundary of the Kern subbasin. I'm guessing that it probably terminates in these hills that we see rising out from Buena Vista Slough. And not being an expert in the hydrogeology of the area, I just want to clarify my answer that assuming the boundary of the Kern subbasin is inclusive of at least the geologic materials, of the Buena Vista Slough there, I would say there's really no other groundwater subbasin in the area that would be receiving this recharge. Again, I just want to caveat that by being unfamiliar with the western boundary of the Kern subbasin.
And as far as you know,
Ms. Kinsey, I'm going to move to strike that answer. He explained he doesn't have the technical basis to offer an opinion on this matter.
I will sustain that, and that response is stricken from the record.
I don't have any further questions for Dr. Davids. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm changing my view here, and I will again look to the room to see if any other party has questions for Dr. Davids. What I would like to do next is I have some questions from Dr. Davids, for Dr. Davids. And then at that point, I would see Mr. Bivens if you have redirect, and then I will see if there's an interest in recross. So that is my plan for the future. At some point in there, we'll take a break. But I think if you're in a good position, Dr. Davids, I would like to go ahead and ask a few questions, if I may.
Of course, may the 4th be with all of us.
Yes, good. I think what I'd like to do is go back to this, one of our favorite exhibits here. I think it's KWBA 133. Ms. Mullen, please. I only have one question about it, I think. Yep, that's it. That's the one.
That's the one.
And what I'm wondering here, and you may have explained this, so I apologize if you're repeating this, but I see your red dash line, and I think I understand the origin of that based on your testimony. I see, I can't actually tell that it's blue, but I see what has been referred to as the blue dashed line, which is 1960 average. I'm reading that right, to the linear regression of 1955 to 1990 data. And then there's a second, I don't know if it's blue or not, but a second line that's the linear regression of 1990 to 2020 data. And I wanted to ask you why those two lines are separate?
Yes, good question. So Ms. Kinsey, the reason those two lines are separate is to characterize a feature of data called inflection. So when you look at a data set, for example, I'm trying to think of a good example. Perhaps if you looked at the acreage of swamplands in California, for example, over time, you would see that there was a precipitous decline in that acreage of swamplands, circa the time period that we've been discussing during this hearing. And then it really sort of flattened off, maybe in the 1910s or 20s or so, and sort of stabilized to where there wasn't a big change. So if you had data points of swampland area in California over time, and you saw the data look like this, and then it kind of went horizontal, it wouldn't be appropriate to do a regression on the entirety of those data, because there's really clearly an inflection point. There's something that happened that generally changed the nature of the data that you see. And so it would be appropriate to actually separate those data into two different categories and perform regressions on those independently because of that inflection point. So that's the idea with this two different regressions. So one is to show that statistically there is no trend from 1990 to 2020, and the other is to show that there is a statistically significant trend using the Pearson's R correlation coefficient and a critical value of that in the 1990 back to 1955 period.
Thank you. And then that raises a question to me: how did you choose the inflection point here?
It's another good question. The inflection point is, as far as I know, there's not a good statistical measure to understand that. I think the data oftentimes has a story that it's trying to tell, and so it's kind of a matter of having the eye to read that story and not to have it say what you want it to say, but to say what is the data telling me, and where might this inflection point lie. I think the 1990s, could it have been one year to the, or 1 5-year period to the left, or 1 5-year period to the right? I think within that probably 5-year scope would be a reasonable assessment of the inflection point. But certainly from 1970. Well, let me add to this answer also that there's this is actually not just something that's happening in Kern County. This yield change in alfalfa is actually something that's happening all over the U.S. and there's well-founded literature from the 1920s all the way through the 1990s and 2000s that kind of show this increase in yield, but sort of with precision land leveling and GPS and precision nutrient management in the 90s and 2000s, that sort of flattened off. So we're not seeing that continue to increase like at a really a global perspective, not a global, but at least at a US wide level. So hopefully those two kind of factors help to understand the choice there.
Thank you. Yes, it does. And would it be fair to say that part of your experience, your overall professional experience and understanding of I don't know what the right word is, but maybe agricultural practices and agricultural changes affected your choice of the inflection point?
That's correct. That's really the nature of my second part that I was trying to explain, but that's a much more concise way of stating it. Thank you.
Thank you. From here, I have questions about, I'm trying to formulate them, but I have questions about the IE calculation. And I thought I jotted down a figure number, but maybe I wrote down KWBA. That might not be right. 142, but I don't think is that right?
There's two different figures that were in the presentation, or rather three that kind of relate to irrigation efficiency, but perhaps we could go to slide 24 on one KWBA 148, and we'll see if that's the one. And then
let's do that. Slide 24 in the presentation.
Is that the one, Ms. Mullen, or there was a few slides preceding this that also had to do with irrigation efficiency?
And I'm not sure I had, there may not be a specific slide, but we're in the right place. So please, if you're answering a question, you know you have a figure that will help me. And let me see if I can formulate an actual question here based on your testimony. I'm looking at the testimony just for the rest of us and for you, but don't bring it up. Let's stay on this slide for the view. I'm looking at KWBA 100, paragraph 78, 79 in that area, and possibly 77. And I wanted to clarify, so this is in paragraph 77, if you're looking at your testimony, Dr. Davids, on what is page 29 of the testimony, I'm not sure about that, and PDF page 30, I believe, there's a sentence that says the net average farm side water duty or estimated AW requirements was calculated as 3.7 acre feet per acre by assuming a 20% quote, distribution loss on district Kern River diversions. And that's quoted. And I wondered if you know off the top of your head or can tell me what the quotation is from.
Yes. Yeah, this is an important clarification, so I appreciate the question here. If we could pull up, let's see here, that would be KWBA 021, and I think it's on page. Well, let's get it up and then see. Hopefully, it jogs my memory. I'm going to verify that this is the right one. Yeah, so if we could just scroll through. So well, let me make sure that this is the right one, and then I'll get to the context for what's going on. So let's see if we could go to maybe like the third, fourth, or fifth page. Maybe just quickly kind of scroll through the pages, and I'll. I think I have this up on my side as well. All right. Yes, this is the one. Thank you. So this is table 2. This is SIPE's 1964 Federal Land Bank assessment of the Buena Vista Water Storage District. Again, it was performed, for the Federal Land Bank, an assessment, I think, of the solvency of the Buena Vista Water Storage District in order to continue some financial dealings that I don't know the extreme particulars of. But what he did and what he reports here are 2 very helpful values, and the quotes actually come directly from this table. So referring back to my testimony, the first quote is on line 2 of page 29 of the hard copy, at least, where it says net average farm side water duty. So if we look at I think it'd be the 5th row from the bottom of the table down in the notes, it states the net average farm side water duty, and then it says 3.7. So that's the first one. And then parenthetically, it states assuming a 20% distribution loss on Kern River diversion. So that's also, let's see, with the calculated 20% distribution loss. So that's kind of the parenthetical statement after the net average farm side water duty. And then it goes on to state that that value is 3.7. And if it would be helpful, I could try to explain my understanding of the 20%, but I think it'd be better for you to ask specific questions.
Right, I think that would be good too. But that is fine. I mostly was looking. This is helpful, but I mostly was looking for the citation because I saw it was a quotation from somewhere, and I wanted to make sure I understood the source. So I appreciate that, Dr. Davids. I'd like to move on from here to, if we can, Ms. Mullen, go back to slide 24, where we were. And I want to make sure I understand this graph. My understanding is that this second point, what is identified as point 2 on this graph, these are the numbers that you calculated using the data that was in this SIPES report. Is that accurate?
Yes. The irrigation efficiency is the ratio of the evapotranspiration of applied water divided by the applied water itself. So the values that we just looked at in the table form the denominator of that equation. And the values in the numerator are formed from my analysis of evapotranspiration using FAO 56. So that's the provenance of those two data sets that come together to form the 57%, which is labeled by 0.2 on this graph.
Thank you. And the 57%, as I had asked before about this, that was an average of the 4 IEs that you calculated for alfalfa, barley, corn, and cotton. Is that right?
That is correct. And
I'm-
actually, I apologize for interrupting, Ms. Kinsey. There's maybe one slight clarification that I think I misspoke yesterday.
Please.
Okay, if we look at note 2, and I should have been looking at this more closely yesterday, and I think this is the correct way to do it, is that, and I'm just going to read note 2. So
I'm sorry, let me stop you. What is note 2 on?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the screen still on slide 24. So it's part of KWBA 142, but it's note 2 on the figure itself.
Oh, I see. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah, so it says 1937 to 1963 estimated IE for 1937 to 1963 is 57% based on an area weighted average IE for those 4 crops. So the clarification I wanted to make is that it's not just a straight average as I suggested yesterday, but it's actually area weighted so that the crops that have a more significant portion of the Buena Vista service area actually are more significantly weighted during this time period.
Ms. Kinsey, I'm going to move to strike that answer. Dr. Davids testified yesterday he had no cotton crop yield data from the Kern County Ag Commissioner for, I believe, the period 1960 to 1985. He appears to now be saying that he used cotton data to calculate this number, which appears to be inconsistent with his prior testimony.
Well, and let me respond to that. I don't think it is. He may have testified that he didn't use the cotton yield data from the 1930s and 40s, but I believe he did testify that he had cotton acreage data.
I'm not going to. I'm going to overrule the motion to strike the testimony. I think this is important. What I will do, Mr. Becerra, and this is not normal, but I will give you a second bite at the apple if you want a chance to ask Dr. David's questions after my questions. Because some new issues have been raised to you, I will allow you the opportunity to do that. I know, Mr. Bivens, this doesn't make you happy, but what is important to me here is to get to the bottom of this. And this is very complicated testimony, and I think the cross-exam is actually quite helpful. So is there anything else you'd like to add, Mr. Becerra?
No, thank you.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, Ms. Kinsey, just to clarify, does Mr. Becerra have an open-ended invitation to recross based on every question that you might ask, or are we limiting his opportunity to this issue, which I submit would be more appropriate than the open-ended invitation, at least at this juncture?
No, I'm going to allow, actually, I'll allow Mr. Becerra to ask questions related to anything that I have asked, because once again, this is, we're processing through this, and I think it is fair, and he would have a chance. Quite frankly, I was going to give him a chance to recross after your redirect. So I am going to allow it. I'm going to allow a broader about any of the questions that I have asked that may bring up new questions. So
Ms. Kinsey, I'll represent for the record. I have no intention to conduct a cross-examination like yesterday.
Good. I probably wouldn't allow that. Thank you.
I don't want to speak out of turn here, but I do believe maybe in like a sentence or two I could clarify Mr. Becerra's question, but that
let's not. Let's go. Let's allow Mr. Becerra to do that separately. Thank you, Dr. Davids. Can we bring the figure back up? I know we had an interlude, but that's slide 24. Please, Ms. Mullen. Okay, and then from this, what I wanted to understand, Dr. Davids, was how you derived 0.1 on this figure.
Yes, this is a very good question, and this is a value that is very much based on a best professional judgment, based on years of experience of working with these data, actually taking these measurements in the field, understanding how irrigation works, and having a strong, again, professional sense of things. So this value is an extrapolation back in time, and the attempt was to capture potential changes in the way that water was applied to the land and potential impacts that would have on irrigation efficiency. And again, the irrigation efficiency is the ratio of the evapotranspiration of applied water divided by the applied water itself. So one of the primary things that happened during this period between points 1 and 2 was improved land leveling. So I saw that very clearly in my analysis of the 1927 and 1928 and 1937 image collections that I poured over in great detail as identified in my testimony. And because of that, and again, I'm thinking it from the context of looking back in time, because land leveling was less prevalent in the early period, and an irrigation form of what I would call wild flood, and I think I described that in my testimony, was more prevalent. In my professional opinion, the best adjustment of irrigation efficiency would be a downward adjustment to account for sort of less sophisticated or less efficient means of spreading that water across the land. And the other thing that factored into this is there are references in the historical materials to the recycling or reuse of water within the Buena Vista Water Storage District. And what that ends up doing is at a field scale, you could have a low irrigation efficiency, but if the runoff from one field is the supply for the next field, and then the runoff from that field becomes a supply for the next field, grouping those three fields together ends up increasing the irrigation efficiency. So this is, in my opinion, a conservatively low irrigation efficiency, considering the potential of reuse that's in the historical materials, and the low irrigation efficiency drives the irrigation diversion requirement up because it's in the denominator. So it's an inverse relationship. The lower IE is, the higher the applied water requirement is.
Thank you. So let me see if I think I understood that you, based on the data point 2, which is based on data, you just explained to me why you thought in your professional judgment that there would be a downward trend in the irrigation efficiency. How did you come to 50% rather than some other lower number, for example, 40%?
Yes. I mean, this is a good question, and as you look backwards in time, and the data becomes less available, I want to be very clear that there is some uncertainty in these numbers. Is it 52%? Is it 48%? Is it 47%? Or so I think I'm want to be very clear to say that, was it exactly 50%? Was it 51%? Was it 49%? The reason I chose 50% was that, again, considering reuse, I think that's a conservatively high number considering reuse. And I think the other factor is if you look at in the literature from the Food and Agriculture Organization, I think a 50% irrigation efficiency for this type of irrigation system is kind of well within the range of an expected value.
Thank you. Those are my questions. Thank you, Dr. Davis. I really appreciate it, going back to some of these graphs.
Yes. No, thank you for your questions. Yeah.
It's quite helpful. And I think from there, we're at 9:57. I would like, Mr. Becerra, I'm hoping you just have very few questions on this. So would that be accurate? How much time do you think you need?
Let me just ask a question. So do you want to proceed with breaking up that if I have some questions to clarify what you just did, I do that now? And then there may be redirect, and then I might do recross later.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, I think I just have a few for now. So we can take a break or we can wait. I'm agnostic at the moment on that.
Well, let's go ahead and let's take a 10-minute break for all of us. It is 9:57. Let's come back at 10:07, and then I will allow you to ask your questions, Mr. Becerra.
Thank you.
All right, it is 10:07. Let's go back on the record. I see Mr. Becerra, Dr. Davids, and Mr. Bivens. So I think we can get started. Mr. Becerra, do you have additional questions for Dr. Davids based on my questions for Dr. Davids?
I do, a few. I don't think it should take very long, hopefully.
Please go ahead.
Ms. Mullen, can we please pull up exhibit KWBA 133? Thank you very much. Dr. Davids, I just need to understand the statistics here a little bit. I didn't take statistics in college and perhaps should have. You use the ITRC metric data from 2016 to 2019 to generate crop coefficients. Is that accurate?
Yes, it's accurate. I think technically the 2017 through 2019 data was used in the final assessment, but I did analyze 2016 through 2019, and then it was used on 12 crops out of 16. But with those caveats, that's correct.
Thank you. And then the red dashed line is your adjustment for changing crop yields from the ITRC metric data and other sources, correct?
The red dashed line is the final curve that was used to make adjustments prior to 1990, the crop coefficient data. That's correct.
Okay. The blue line Ms. Kinsey was asking about, you didn't use to adjust the current crop demand data. Is that accurate?
Yes, and I do agree with Ms. Kinsey that the color is potentially, I'm not sure if it's blue, but I think we're talking about the same one. The left.
Yeah, let's get that straight for the record. The curve I'm referencing, you have labeled as, and I need to make sure I'm getting this right. You have labeled as linear regression of 1990 through 2020 data. Do you see that curve?
Yeah, so that's actually in reference to the curve off to the right. So I think it's perhaps a bad choice of symbology, and it's just differentiated by color. But the lower dashed line is in reference to the curve on the right. And then the upper, the linear regression 1955 through 1990 is in reference to the regression I think that we're trying to speak about. And I think we're on the same page, but we just want to be clear.
Yeah, for clarity of the record, I want to ask you about linear regression of 1990 to 2020 data, just for clarity.
Okay.
That period is essentially from current times 30 years back to 1990. Is that accurate?
Yes, and because it's inclusive of both sides of the data, there's a total of 7 data points. That's correct.
And you did not use that regression in any way in adjusting your crop demand data backwards in time. Is that accurate?
That's correct. For the period from 1990 through the 2019, which is the last year of my analysis, there was no correction for crop coefficient data. That's correct.
Okay. So let's look at that linear regression of 1990 to 2020 data in your legend. The R squared value is 0.007. Is that accurate?
That is correct. And yeah, R squared is the coefficient of determination. That's correct.
Does an R squared value of 0.007 tell you that there is no statistical relationship among the data?
An R squared of 0.007 suggests something of a shotgun blast, if you will. And what I mean by that is that it's a very low number, suggesting there's not a strong linear relationship among those 7 data points.
So just to clarify, you could not use the 1990 to 2020 data to adjust your crop demand numbers because it presented you with no meaningful statistical relationship. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's correct.
From state's testimony.
I'll overrule it. Let's hear what Dr. Davids has to say.
Would you please, just for sake of clarity, Mr. Becerra, repeat the question?
I can attempt to do so. You could not use the 1990 to 2020 data to adjust your crop demand numbers because that data presented you with no statistically meaningful regression value. Is that accurate?
I think if I exchange meaningful with significant in your statement, yes, I think that's correct.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. So can we please go to your PowerPoint slide KWBA 148 and then slide 24. Yes, exactly, Ms. Mullen. Amazing. Now, Dr. Davids, you testified in response to Ms. Kinsey's question that your point number 1 for the period 1885 was based on your professional judgment. Is that accurate?
That is correct. In the absence of actual measurements of applied water, there's a professional judgment that needs to be made based on irrigation practices of the time.
And your professional judgment was based on the predominance of wild flood irrigation. Is that accurate?
I believe that's the terminology that I use in my written testimony. I can pull up the specific paragraph if you'd like, but
no, that's fine. Thank you. Wild flood irrigation, would that mean water not being routed through canals?
I don't think that's an accurate characterization, no.
Okay. Can we please pull up exhibit KWBA 13, Ms. Mullen? And Dr. Davids, do you recognize this document as the 1920 Barnes report? And if you need to scroll, please feel free.
We can save some time. I'm growing familiar with this vantage point of the Barnes report. So yes, this is indeed the Barnes report.
Okay, Ms. Mullen, could we please go to PDF page 27? And for the record, this is page 22 of the Barnes report. Dr. Davids, do you see the heading maintenance of canals on that page?
I do.
And could we please scroll down to the next page? Do you see that discussion ends on the next page at the heading operation of canal system?
I do.
And you relied on KWBA 13 as a source of information in your statistical analysis of adjustment of alfalfa crop yields, correct?
I did, yes.
Ms. Mullen, can we please scroll back up to the preceding page of KWBA 13? Dr. Davids, the discussion under the heading maintenance of canals, you did not consider this discussion in preparing your opinion concerning irrigation efficiencies within Buena Vista service area, correct?
That's incorrect, and I'd like to explain why there's a misunderstanding of what irrigation efficiency is, if I may.
I will ask the question, Dr. Davids, if I can. I'm not sure that's Dr. Davids, you described, it'll be a direction. Dr. Davids, you described what you perceive as a misunderstanding of irrigation efficiencies. Will you please describe to me, provide a description of irrigation efficiency and a definition?
Yes, I would gladly appreciate the chance to do so. Irrigation efficiency is a metric of on-farm water application as it relates to the amount of that water that's applied to evapotranspiration. Okay, so if we want to speak about irrigation efficiency, again, we're down at the field scale. So we're not talking about water distribution at a lateral level or a sublateral level. What we're talking about is when water is passed through what's called a turnout, a farm gate delivery, onto a specific field. And Dr. Miltenberger talked about the fact that post the district plan, there were fields on the order of 10-acre checks. The irrigation efficiency is in regards to what happens beyond the farm gate, beyond the turnout. And what's the method that's used to distribute water within the field, not to distribute water from the point of diversion to the point that is delivered to the field. So this is the clarification that I'd like to make.
Thank you, Dr. Davids. Let me just follow up on that. So the irrigation efficiency, as I understand what you just said, does not include seepage or spillage from canals.
And that's precisely correct. And that's why it's separated out in my analysis as a different term.
Thank you so much. Mr. Becerra, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you. Dr. Davids, in calculating, or excuse me, in using seepage and spillage in your analysis, you relied entirely on information provided to you by Mr. Torres. Is that accurate?
Objection. Asked and answered, and we went over this at length in Mr. Becerra's cross yesterday.
Sustained. And Mr. Becerra, I don't think we touched on seepage or spillage at all in my questions, and we only touched on it tangentially just now. So I'm going to limit your questions on this topic.
Thank you. Dr. Davids, you just testified irrigation efficiency is at the field level, downstream of the head gate, correct?
That is correct.
Did you have objective data as to where the head gates were for fields within Buena Vista's service area as of 1885?
Well, Mr. Hammond Hall made some beautiful maps for us to admire and hang on our walls, but he did not mark the location of every single delivery point within the Buena Vista Water Storage District, unfortunately. So the answer is no.
Okay. Could we, Ms. Mullen, could we please scroll down to the next page of KWBA 13? And if we could please scroll down a little further below the heading of operations system. Dr. Davids, do you see the discussion about at the bottom of the page, it's page 23, the exhibit? How do you see the discussion of how Miller and Lux controlled the head gates into the laterals at the time?
I'd like to read the paragraph here.
And let me interject, Mr. Becerra, are you going to connect this line of questioning with the irrigation efficiency at the field scale? My concern here is that Dr. Davids just informed us that that calculation is made at the field scale and does not include the canal operation. So I'm wondering where you're going.
I'd like to understand Dr. David's understanding of how the head gates were operated as of 1920.
All right, I'll allow that.
Yeah. Okay.
And perhaps I can interpose an objection on undue consumption of time with respect to this paragraph. I think if Mr. Becerra wants to ask Dr. Davids the question he just asked, that would be appropriate and we'd move right along.
All right, well, let's try it, please, Mr. Becerra. if that's your question, let's get there.
Dr. Davids, did you consider any discussion in Exhibit KWBA 13 in calculating on-farm efficiency downstream of the head gates as of 1920?
Well, I think in formulating an opinion on irrigation efficiency, there were a number of different factors that I took into account. Important sources of information were the 1928 image collection that I georeferenced and at depth analyzed to understand land leveling and conveyance facilities. If you actually have a question about my knowledge of the location of head gates, I think I've looked at perhaps more aerial images than most of us on the call of this particular area, and have a fairly deep understanding of the extent of land leveling and conveyance facilities within the Buena Vista Water Storage District as of 1928.
I just have a very simple question.
I'd like to finish my thought if I could.
You can go ahead and finish, Dr. Davids, and then we'll return to you, Mr. Becerra.
And the second point was that, of course, that spatially explicit information from the image collections of 1928, 1937 had to be woven together with the historical narrative, which in part the Barnes report of that we're looking at here in KWBA 013, and notably that became part of the Bulletin 9, which is a deeply important reference that I think I have a fairly firm grasp on. Was folded together with that understanding. So yes, I did consider this narrative together with the georeference image collections that I referenced earlier.
You can, in your opinion, you considered the 1920 Barnes report because it was incorporated into Bulletin 9 in some way. Is that right?
I don't think that's an accurate representation of what I just said.
Ms. Kinsey, I have no further questions.
All right, thank you. In fairness, I will turn to you, Mr. Jacobs. Do you have any additional questions based on my line of questioning? If you're still with us.
I am absolutely still with you. I do not have any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And also in fairness, Ms. Spalletta, do you have any additional questions?
I do not.
Thank you. At this point, I will turn to you, Mr. Bivens. Do you care to redirect your witness at this time?
I do, and I will again try to be efficient.
Thank you.
Ms. Mullen, could you please pull up Exhibit KWBA 148, slide 1, please? Dr. Davids, yesterday you testified on cross that you did not analyze potential accumulations to storage in conducting your analysis. Did I have that right?
That is correct.
Why not?
Well, there's really three reasons. I think, and let's just start through it and see how many we get to. But first of all, as it's clearly stated on the title of my presentation here, my analysis was really firmly focused on understanding historical crop water consumption, really looking at crop water demands, and then the necessary water applications and water diversions from the Kern River system that would be necessary to support those that amount of crop water demands. The way that I looked at that really had two operational scenarios, right? So the one operational scenario was where water was diverted directly from the Kern River in order to meet those historical crop water demands. Again, conservatively high crop water demands are what we've been referring to as upper range estimates of those crop water demands because of all the things that we've spoken about earlier in this hearing. The second condition was routing water through the Buena Vista Lake complex and assuming that that was full of water and sort of generously, again, conservatively, including that full amount of evaporation, which sums to 122,000 acre feet in a year if that reservoir complex is full, and then adding that on to the crop water demands, and then that providing the range of historical crop water requirements. The other reason that I did not generate or investigate reservoir operations is because frankly, the data is not available in order to perform an operational analysis of the Buena Vista Lake Reservoir on a monthly time step. As I've mentioned before, the analysis that I performed, we've been looking at it in an aggregated sense on a calendar year basis. But at a monthly time step, we just simply don't have the data to include Buena Vista Lake operations for the period of the analysis from 1885 through 2019.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, can you please pull up exhibit KWBA 014 and go to PDF page 72, please? Thank you. Dr. Davids, do you recall reviewing this table 26 from Bulletin 9 yesterday?
I believe I had nightmares of it from last night. No, yes, I do recall this table. Yes.
And why doesn't this table provide sufficient data for you to analyze potential accumulations to storage from roughly August 30th, 1911 to August 31st, 1918?
Yeah, so as I just spoke about, the nature of my analysis was at its core, from a time perspective, on a monthly time step. And so this table provides aggregated data at an annual time step. And so, really there's no way to disaggregate those values and spread it out amongst the months in order to make it congruent with the remainder of my analysis.
Thank you. And we talked a lot yesterday about evaporations from Buena Vista Lake. And in that context, Mr. Becerra also asked you about seepage in cells 1 and 2 of Buena Vista Lake. Do you recall that?
I do, yep.
Do you have any understanding of whether a significant amount of seepage occurs when water is stored in cells 1 and 2 of Buena Vista Lake?
Well, there's some interesting information in KWBA 014, which is Bulletin 9. For some reason I've lost track of which KWBA number are we looking at right now?
We are in Bulletin 9.
That's what I thought. I saw the elephant on the front, so I wanted to make sure, but that's right. So if we could go to page 68 of the PDF, Ms. Mullen, that'd be great. There's a statement that's below the table, Ms. Mullen, if you would scroll down a little bit more. It starts on maybe the 7th line from the bottom. And it starts with, the sentence starts with seepage losses. And I think maybe it's just helpful for me to read the sentence here. It says, seepage losses from the lake are considered negligible as the time required for the lake to become dry is so long enough to account for all of this lowering by evaporation. And I think the English is a little bit confusing here, but what they're stating is that they have actual measurements of evaporation in Bulletin 9 from 1920. In fact, they're listed up on a monthly time step just above this sentence. And what the author is saying here is that if you just account for seepage, there's enough loss from the lake to account for the lake drying. Even if you assume I hope I said that correct. If you just account for evaporation, I think I said that incorrectly. If you only account for evaporation, that's enough to explain the drying of the lake, even assuming seepage is negligible, which is exactly what they say here. Seepage losses are considered negligible.
And I hope I'm reading this right. I think that the next sentence states, if a reservoir of a small depth as this did have any material seepage loss, it would have little value for storage. Do you agree with the author's conclusion in that sentence?
Objection, vague and ambiguous. Mr. Bivens started this line of questioning discussing cells 1 and 2, and now we're on to the whole lake.
There we go. I will sustain that in part. Let's clarify. Is there a way to scroll up? Maybe Mr. Bivens, do you know, to clarify that this text we're talking about refers to the whole lake, or can you just point me to some of the text so we can clarify that for the record?
Well, maybe I'll come back to that.
Okay.
Dr. Davids, let's actually, Ms. Mullen, let's go to page 198, please. Dr. Davids, with respect to the entire historical area of Buena Vista Lake, including cell 3, are the evaporative losses significant?
Well, in agreement with the authors of Bulletin 9, I think we can quite confidently say yes. In fact, I'd like to read, I think it's starting on the second sentence of the second paragraph here, the first full paragraph where it says the loss by evaporation. And it says the loss by evaporation from this lake, referring to Buena Vista Lake in the previous sentence, is so large a proportion of the water delivered into it as to make its use inadvisable for any water which can be conserved by other means. So I think in agreement with the authors of Bulletin 9, I would certainly agree that the evaporation losses from this lake facility were significant and making its use inadvisable. And even at this time, they were looking for alternative methods for storage.
Okay, Ms. Mullen, would you please go back to page 75 of the PDF? I think that's page 68 of the document. Let's scroll down. Dr. Davids, can you remind me what page we were talking about seepage earlier?
Yes. And I was going to say I appreciate these wells or these pictures of artesian wells, but it's probably not where we want to go with the conversation. I think it's on page. It is 68 of the PDF. Is that what you went to?
68 of the PDF, Ms. Mullen. Thank you. So, Dr. Davids, referring back to the sentence we read on this page earlier about material seepage loss, do you agree with that statement with respect to the entirety of Buena Vista Lake?
Well, I think it's relatively clear, and this is a question that Dr. Miltenberger, I'm certain, would have additional insights too, but I think it's relatively clear that the context of Bulletin 9 was that it was analyzing Buena Vista Lake in its entirety, and that the authors here are suggesting that in its entirety, that seepage losses from the lake are considered negligible because of the factors that I've previously discussed.
And so if there were any material seepage loss and that loss were combined with the significant evaporative losses, why would that make Buena Vista Lake of little value for storage?
Objection, vague as to time. We're talking about cells 1 and 2 now or Buena Vista Lake in the past?
Will you clarify, Mr. Bivens?
Yes, Dr. Davids, with respect to the operation of the entire Buena Vista Lake, cells 1, 2, and 3, if there were any material seepage loss combined with the evaporative losses, why would that make Buena Vista Lake of little value for storage?
Well, I guess we could consider maybe the parable of Jack and Jill, right? If you go to the well to fetch a pail of water, I think the analogy here would be that if you had a bucket of water where all the water was spilling out the top on the way back to the house in the form of evaporation, and you had holes in the bottom where all the water was draining out because of seepage, and you get back to your house and the pail of water is empty, that device is not a good mechanism of storage of water. So I think that's perhaps an analogy that's helpful.
You would want a different bucket.
You would probably want to have a different bucket, one that maybe had a smaller opening at the top in terms of it's letting water out the top, right, in relation to the volume that it could store. And you'd probably also want to have a bucket that didn't have holes in the bottom. And I think the combination of a smaller top and less holes on the bottom would lead to a more effective device for storing water.
All right, thank you, Dr. Davids. Ms. Mullen, can we have exhibit KWBA 133, please? Dr. Davids, you testified yesterday that you used data from the 1920 Barnes report to test your regression. Do I have that right?
That is correct.
And the data points from the 1920 Barnes report that you used are represented by that orange X and that green cross at 1920. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Ms. Mullen, could you pull up exhibit KWBA 13, please? And perhaps we'll, oh, you did identify this earlier as the Barnes report. Okay. Scroll to page PDF 60, please, Ms. Mullen. And Dr. Davids, could you just take a look at that paragraph and let me know when you're done reading it?
I am done. Thank you.
After reading this paragraph, do you have an understanding of where Mr. Barnes, strike that. After reading this paragraph, do you have an understanding of the sources on which Mr. Barnes relied for developing his yield estimates?
Objection, misstates testimony. This says nothing about yield estimates.
It does say.
I'm not sure it's the testimony, but I think it does maybe misstate the information on this page. I'm not sure, Mr. Bivens.
Let me.
Brian, can you try again?
Yeah. Dr. Davids, after reading this paragraph, do you understand that Mr. Barnes obtained information that's reflected in this report from local officials at Miller and Lux?
I do.
Objection vague is ambiguous as to information obtained.
I'll overrule it. Let's get to the answer.
Perhaps I can just read the paragraph. I don't know if that'd be helpful, but acknowledgements are made and thanks are due to the local officials of Miller and Lux for information granted and courtesy is extended by them during the course of this investigation, whose results have been outlined in the foregoing. I do recall Dr. Miltenberger reviewing this portion of this document. And I think what we could rightfully interpret as for information granted in the middle of the sentence is that essentially this document is a summary of the results of information provided directly by the officials of Miller and Lux.
Thank you, Dr. Davids. Ms. Mullen, could we go to PDF page 55, please? And Dr. Davids, would you just read that first full paragraph on this page and let me know when you're done?
Okay, thank you. I'm done.
And based on this paragraph, what's your understanding of Mr. Barnes' estimate of the ton per acre yield for pastured alfalfa?
Well, let's see, based on the reading of this paragraph, it appears to start off by saying that alfalfa land that's used for pasture, and then it goes on to talk about the irrigation sort of scheduling, if you will. And then I think it's starting in the third sentence, it says a good yield of alfalfa under these circumstances. And under these circumstances refers back to the pasturing, the cultural practice of pasturing on this alfalfa. Then it goes on to state is to be 5 tons per acre.
And when did Mr. Barnes, under what circumstances did Mr. Barnes believe it was appropriate to use a 6 ton per acre estimate for alfalfa?
So if we read the rest of the paragraph, starting with when the alfalfa is not pastured, the first irrigation is postponed, and then so it goes on to talk about irrigation scheduling. And then towards the end, it says which system produces an average yield. And again, which system would be referring back to the cultural practice of not pasturing, not directly grazing on the alfalfa, produces an average yield of 6 tons.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, can we go to PDF page 26, please? Dr. Davis, let me ask you at the outset, do you have an understanding of who in 1920 would have been the principal landowner in what is now the Buena Vista Water Storage District service area?
Yes, based on my reading of the historical materials and also the presentations by Dr. Milton Berger, I understand that the Miller and Lux operations, or I don't know if it was incorporated, or the Miller and Lux, again, the Miller and Lux operation was the primary landowner within the Buena Vista Water Storage District.
And what specifically was Miller and Lux's business?
Well, if I understand it correctly, Miller and Lux were, I think they were both German immigrants, and again, I'm not a historian, but they were butchers, and they were butchers in San Francisco, and they were trying to run a vertically integrated, meat operation. And essentially, they were trying to produce forage for their cattle operation, which would support their meat packing in San Francisco.
Ms. Kinsey, I'm going to move to strike that answer. Dr. Davis just admitted it's beyond his professional expertise.
That's stricken. I think we can look to Dr. Milton Berger's testimony on that. So Dr. Davids, or I suppose Mr. Bivens, back to you.
Dr. Davids, it's hard for me to read this. The second sentence of the first full paragraph reads, the Miller and Lux fields are mostly used for pasture as well as hay. And so the first irrigation is given in October or November when possible to give the foxtail a good start and make pasture during the winter. What do you understand that sentence to mean about the relationship between whether alfalfa is grown for pasture or not on Miller and Lux's lands?
Well, I think the sentence is fairly plain to say that the Miller and Lux fields are mostly used for pasture. So, you know, mostly is not a quantitative word, but it's certainly more than half. And so I think what this is saying is that certainly more than half of their fields were operated under a pasture cultural practice of directly grazing on those alfalfa fields.
And if you could just read the rest of the paragraph and let me know when you're done, please, Dr. Davids.
Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
What do you understand Mr. Barnes's estimate to have been for the ton per acre yield of alfalfa for Miller and Lux's lands?
I think referring to the second to last sentence, it says, the 3 irrigations as outlined above produce 4 cuttings and winter pasture. And a good yield under these circumstances is said to be 5 tons per acre. The life of alfalfa, well, that's not appropriately related. So stopping there, I think it's fairly clear that this sentence is stating that the good yield of alfalfa is 5 tons per acre.
Specifically for Miller and Lux's lands, correct?
That's correct.
Ms. Mullen, could you please pull up KWBA 133? Dr. Davids, having reviewed those sections of the Barnes report that we just went through, are you still confident in those data points as a test for your regression analysis?
Yes, I am.
Why is that?
Well, I think what we just looked through, number one, it provides further evidence of the source of the information that was provided by Miller and Lux to Barnes in support of the preparation of his report. And so in that sense, I think we can be assured that there's a trustworthy source of information. And number two, the regression is sort of conservatively split or sort of conservatively splits these 2 data points. And what I mean by conservative is that, and I don't recall the exact value, but it's either 5.8 or 5.9 is the yield prediction with the red dashed line. And again, 5.8 or 5.9 is quite a bit closer to 6, which is again that upper range that we've been speaking about throughout this whole discussion. And so, in that sense, I'm confident that those values are still a strong validation of the conservative nature of this regression.
Ms. Mullen, could you please pull up exhibit KWBA 20, PDF page 28, please? Dr. Davids, do you recall seeing this slide during your cross-examination yesterday?
I do recall this table, yes.
And what does it show about alfalfa yields between, it looks like 1932 and 1940 within Buena Vista Water Storage District service area?
Ms. Mullen, would you mind zooming in on the left side of the table just so we can be sure to see? And I know there was for me, it's still difficult to read the top value, but I think what this table shows is that the yield of alfalfa in tons per acre ranged between 5.6 tons per acre in 1932 upwards to 7.9 tons per acre in 1938. And again, the 1939 value is difficult for me to ascertain.
Are you still confident in your regression analysis for alfalfa yields overall after having seen these numbers?
Objection, vague and ambiguous. Oh, the whole time period, 1920.
You can clarify, Mr. Bivens, is it the whole time period or a specific date?
Yeah, sure. Dr. Davids, having seen these numbers, are you still confident in your overall regression analysis for alfalfa yields for the whole time period?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, and let's explore why. If we could, Ms. Moen, would you mind pulling up exhibit KWBA 119? What KWBA 119, well, I'll wait until it comes up here. Okay, great. I suppose we'll need to zoom in a little bit. Now what this represents here is we've been looking a lot at that, that cropping time series where it shows alfalfa in the first period and then cotton and then orchards. I think we're all familiar with that exhibit. This is simply the exact same data, but presented in a different way. So it's in a tabular form. So it's a little bit easier to be a bit more precise about the numbers. And so, Ms. Mullen, if we could zoom into the period from 1932 through 1939, which I believe overlaps. And I suppose before we scroll down, if you don't mind scrolling up to the top, just so we can make sure to get our columns correct. So the first column is year, and the second column is alfalfa. And the values represent the acreage of that crop. And so let's go down to the 1932 through 1939 period. Now these values that we're looking at, if you can tell just by looking at it, you can see in 1914, alfalfa peaked out at 38,500 acres. And what you can see is somewhat of a precipitous decline in alfalfa acreage into the 1930s. And so you actually see a decline of over a factor of 4. So it's less than 25% of the alfalfa that was produced in 1914 was being cultivated in 1931. And so one of the reasons, one of the things that I just want to bring into the discussion here is that when you reduce your footprint of a crop, in fact, it's not just alfalfa that's reducing, it's the overall cultivation of crops within the Buena Vista Water Storage District overall. In fact, the rightmost column represents the percent of land cultivated. So we see in 1914, it was 86.4%. In 1932, for example, it was, 1931, for example, it was only 24%. So there's been a consolidation of agricultural production within the Buena Vista Water Storage District. Now, if you had 5 apple trees and someone came and said you have to cut down 4 of them, but you really like the apples, which apple trees would you cut down? Would you cut down the apple trees that produce the most apples? Or would you choose the 4 apple trees that were maybe the most disease ridden and maybe the scrubbiest and smallest, and you'd keep that 1 apple tree that produced the most amount of apples? So my point is that when you consolidate, you would consolidate towards the fields that are most productive. And so, in this consolidation towards the fields that are most productive, it's quite likely and quite possible that there is an influence on the yield from that consolidation during this time period. And the second point I want to make is that there was significant changes in land leveling as noticed in the aerial image collections that I analyzed from 1928 through 1937 as the district implemented their district plan. And so the improvements in land leveling could also improve alfalfa yields during that period.
Thank you, Dr. Davids. So let's move to exhibit KWBA 148, slide 27, please. Dr. Davids, does this slide reflect information that you received from Nick Torres?
Yes, as discussed yesterday, this slide does reflect information in my interviews and field visit with Mr. Torres.
And Ms. Mullen, can we go to the next slide, please? Dr. Davids, this slide also reflects information that you received from Nick Torres.
Yes, that is true.
You didn't blindly copy what Mr. Torres told you into these slides, did you?
No, of course not. As a professional engineer and a scientist, it's always important to filter the information that you receive through the framework of plausibility. I think I referred to this yesterday as the laugh test. If information is laughable, then of course you should write it off as, or at least mark it as potentially uncredible or erroneous. And so all of this information was passed through my filter of plausibility and reasonableness from a technical perspective, not a legal perspective, to make sure that it passed that test of plausibility. And in addition to that, Mr. Torres, again, has 25 and a half years of experience. So it's not like somebody who just started, to run around and make guesses about these data. In fact, since the early 90s, he's had extensive training at the ITRC under the folks who operate that facility, extensive training on flow measurement, and the quantification and techniques for the quantification of flows in canals. And it's by which by implementing these skills that he's obtained over those 25 and a half years that these values are, in my opinion, reliable.
So fair to say that the information that's reflected in slides 27 and 28 is filtered through your professional expertise?
Absolutely, yes.
Ms. Mullen, can we pull up exhibit KWBA 100, please? We'll go to PDF page 6. And let's scroll down. I believe we're towards the bottom here. Ah, perfect. Dr. Davids, in estimating the upper range of theoretical Kern River diversions for irrigation within the current Buena Vista Water Storage District service area as of December 1914, you assumed that an adequate water supply was available, correct?
That is correct.
And you specifically assumed that an adequate water supply was available from the Kern River, right?
That is correct.
Have you ever verified whether 352,700 acre feet of Kern River water was available in 1914?
The answer is no, and the reason is because, again, my analysis was focused on characterizing this upper range of demands due to irrigation and crop cultivation, and not necessarily how supplies met or did not meet those demands.
Ms. Mullen, could you please pull up exhibit KWBA 16, please? And Ms. Mullen, perhaps we could scroll down 1 or 2 pages. I believe there's a title page. Ah, perfect. Dr. Davids, are you familiar with this document?
Yes, I am. This is the what's often referred to as the Hyatt document, I believe, but it was authored by Hammett and addressed towards or presented to the Honorable Edward Hyatt here as the district plan.
Ms. Mullen, could we scroll to PDF page 14, please? And Dr. Davids, do you see that table at the top of the page there?
I do, yes.
What do you understand this table to show?
Objection, any testimony by Dr. Davids is beyond the scope of his original testimony.
Well,
Go ahead, Mr. Bivens.
It's certainly not beyond the scope of his cross-examination, where we, addressed this issue of water availability at some length yesterday.
Mr. Becerra, do you care to respond?
I don't believe I referenced this document, and Dr. Davids has stated frequently he assumed that there was adequate water supplies in every year as part of his analysis.
I think I'm going to sustain the objection, Mr. Bivens. I think this is outside of the scope of Dr. David's testimony, so let's move along. I'm sorry, outside of the scope of Mr. Becerra's cross-examination, excuse me.
Understood. Dr. Davids, should your analysis be read to suggest that Buena Vista actually diverted 352,700 acre feet of water for irrigation in 1914?
Objection, his testimony is all theoretical.
Overruled, I think that's exactly the question.
Yes, yes, to be very specific, and I forget the way you phrased the question now, but it should not be interpreted as such. As Mr. Becerra just clarified for us, it's an upper range estimate, so the actual values of diversions for the purposes of irrigation, we would expect to be lower than that range, but not exactly either the top or bottom of the range. And potentially significantly lower if there were insufficient water supplies within the Kern River to provide that irrigation water demand.
Thank you, Dr. Davids. I have no further questions.
At this point, I'll ask you, Mr. Becerra, will you have questions on recross based on that redirect? And you are on mute.
Once again, someday I'll get good at this. Yes, I do have questions.
And what is your estimate about the amount of time? And will it be more than 5 minutes?
Yes.
Okay, let's go ahead and take a break, a 10-minute break, and we will return at 11:17.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, it's 11:17. Let's go back on the record and get started. I see Dr. Davids, Mr. Bivens, and Mr. Becerra. And I believe it's time for me to hand it off to you, Mr. Becerra. If you have additional questions for the witness within the scope of Mr. Bivens' redirect, please go ahead.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, could we please pull up exhibit KWBA 14 and go to PDF page 72? Dr. Davids, do you see that we're looking at bulletin 9's table 26?
I do, yes.
You testify you didn't use this data in your analysis because it doesn't reflect a monthly time step. Is that accurate?
Objection, misstates testimony.
Overruled.
The only reason I hesitated to answer that question is because there were the column estimated total acre feet of evaporation. If we remember on KWBA 107, there's a plot during this time period as a dashed line within that blue range of that figure that I do include the 8 evaporation values for this time period. But other than that, I think your statement is accurate.
You consider the annual evaporation numbers in this table adequate to support your analysis, but not the remainder of the data in this table. Is that correct?
That's incorrect.
Did you use the annual evaporation data in your testimony?
The reason I think that your previous statement was incorrect is because I presented the evaporation as a validation of the range of evaporations that I'm presenting as a possible or a theoretical range, but I did not base my analysis on those values.
Thank you. I appreciate the clarification. You considered the annual evaporation data in this table as sufficient to use for validating your analysis. Is that accurate?
On an annual time step, that is correct.
Okay. And I believe you referred to Buena Vista Lake as a leaky bucket in your Jack and Jill analysis. Is that accurate?
Objection, misstates testimony.
Well, at first, I think it was a Jack and Jill analogy, so it'll make that slight correction. But I think that's accurate, so I'm going to overrule the objection.
I would like to disagree with Mr. Bivens, sorry, Mr. Becerra's statement and clarify the context of the analogy, if I could.
Well, let me just ask you analogize Jack and Jill having a leaky bucket to continued use of Buena Vista Lake Reservoir. Is that accurate?
That is not accurate, and I'll explain why. The reason is because in the context of the question, Mr. Bivens was asking me if there was to be seepage in Buena Vista Lake, how would that lead what type of reservoir or storage facility would Buena Vista Lake be? And so I very carefully articulated that this would be like a bucket with a big top representing a large surface area open for evaporation. And if there were seepage, then it would have lots of holes in the bottom as well. And the combination of those two things would make for a very poor storage device, right? Now, the important thing here is that Mr. Bivens asked if there were seepage, what would that be like? And I explained the Jack and Jill analogy. Now, the reality is as we've already seen in bulletin 9 on page, let's see if I can pull that up. On page 68 of the PDF, the reality is that seepage losses from the lake are considered negligible by the authors of bulletin 9. And therefore, to modify my analogy to be reflective of the actual condition of Buena Vista Lake, it would be like a bucket with a very, very broad top, perhaps like a gold mining pan, that you were trying to carry that water back after fetching the pail of water, and the water is coming out from evaporation. But no, there are not significant holes in the bottom per the opinions of the authors of Bulletin 9.
Thank you. If we analogize, as you have, Buena Vista Lake Reservoir to Jack and Jill's bucket, Bulletin 9's table 26 demonstrates that it was in fact being used to store water as of the time of Bulletin 9. Is that accurate?
Well, I don't see the connection between the analogy and how that relates to whether Bulletin 9 states that the reservoir was being used for storage, but from the historical narrative and my understanding of Bulletin 9, if your question is, was Buena Vista Lake used to store water, then the answer plainly is yes.
And water would have had to be diverted from the Kern River into Buena Vista Lake Reservoir in order to store water there. Is that accurate?
Well, it's of course, a reservoir has two primary inflows, well, if not three, and those would be surface inflows, groundwater inflows, and precipitation. And so with the caveat that precipitation is 6.3 inches on average for the area over the period of my investigation, and with the caveat that we're assuming that groundwater inflows into the lake are zero or negligible, then yes, in order for there to be an increase in storage in a lake, it would have to have surface inflows into that lake.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, can we please go to exhibit KWBA 13? And I believe, yes, thank you, Ms. Mullen. I believe we want, I think I just saw this was PDF page 26. Dr. David, yes, PDF page 26. Dr. Davids, do you recognize this page of the report?
Yes, I do.
And in your redirect, you referred to the word mostly in the third line. Do you see that word?
I do, yes.
You don't have any quantitative data to understand what mostly meant as Mr. Barnes used it, do you?
What I would characterize if I were to put a quantitative value to mostly is that it's greater than 50%. That's the firmest quantification that I would put on mostly.
And that's based on your understanding of what the word mostly means. Is that accurate?
I think that's accurate, yes.
Okay, thank you. Can we please, Ms. Mullen, can we please go to exhibit KWBA 133? Thank you. Dr. Davids, do you recall after you discussed the statements for crop yields for alfalfa from the Barnes report, you then stated that whether it was 5 tons per acre or 6 tons per acre, it nonetheless still split your regression? Or I'm sorry, your regression would still split the data points between 6 tons per acre and 5 tons per acre. Do you recall that?
I do, and there's a visual representation of that splitting, that we all see on the screen here with the red dashed line progressing between the 2 points from the Barnes report.
The red dashed line is much closer to the orange X representing 6 tons per acre than the green plus sign representing 5 tons per acre. Is that accurate?
That's correct, and that's a conservatively high, interpretation, exactly.
And when you refer to the regression, this is the regression you developed between the data reflected by your orange triangle and the data reflected by your green dot on this exhibit. Is that accurate?
Yes, I believe my written testimony is to be clear on that point.
And that regression was developed solely based on post 1955 data. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think as we discussed at length yesterday, the data points from Barnes were used as a validation. They were not actually part of the statistical process of developing the linear regression, and then the data subsequent or inclusive and subsequent to 1955 were used for that purpose.
And your regression of the data from 2016 through 2019 did not include a regression of the 1990 through 2020 data. Is that accurate?
I don't think I understand the question. Could you rephrase,
Okay,
please?
yeah, I can break it up. The regression relationship you developed among the 1990 through 2020 data as reflected on this exhibit, you did not use that for any purpose in developing the regression shown on the red dashed line. Is that accurate?
I think there's an independence between these two, I think is what you're referring to. So yes, there is an independence between those two linear features.
And the red dashed line reflecting your regression does not include any of the 1930s data from Mr. Stanton's 1941 report. Is that accurate?
But that is accurate. It is not included on this, and yeah, that's correct.
And just for the record, Mr. Stanton's report is exhibit KWBA 20. Is that correct? And we can, that's unfair. Ms. Mullen, can we please pull up exhibit KWBA 20? Dr. Davids, do you recognize this as the 1941 Stanton report that is exhibit KWBA 20?
I do, especially per the stamp there on the bottom right.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, can we please pull up exhibit KWBA 119? And Dr. Davids, this is your table of, I believe it's cropping acres over time. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's correct. So we've been looking at, and I think,
Dr. Davids, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to try to get through this quickly. I don't want to consume all day on recross.
yeah.
Is this your tape? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes, I think it's important to clarify that this is exactly the same data that we've been looking at during the course of this entire discussion in a visual format with the different colors. I think it's KWBA. It's KWBA 105, and this is a tabular summary of that. That's much harder to interpret in its entirety, and so yes.
Okay, and do you see the source line at the top of the exhibit?
Zoom in, Ms. Mullen, just so I can see the source line. Dr. Davids probably knows which one it is, but I don't. Thank you.
Do you see the source line, Dr. Data? Or sorry, Dr. Davids.
Did you
You use a lot
call
of
me
data,
Dr.
I'm
Data?
I didn't mean to make any Star Trek references. My
Well,
apologies.
I am
Not
a
before.
huge Brent Spiner fan for the record, so
Do you see on that line that source line indicates where this data came from? Is that accurate?
I'm going to say that's not accurate, and I can explain.
Well, I think let me ask you a couple questions. I think I can understand it. That is a file name that includes the word Python. Is that accurate?
That is inaccurate in the case that I think I don't think any of us see the word Python on the screen, but it does say .py.
Well, if we could back up in the file name, about halfway through the file name, there's the word Python. Do you see
Okay, thank you, Mr. Becerra. Yes, I did forget that buried in the file path name that was there. Yes.
You developed a Python script in conducting your analysis. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, and I think that's very clearly stated in the written narrative, in the written testimony as well. Python is a way that you can interact with data, much like a spreadsheet. You would interact with data. So yes, it's an analytical tool used by data scientists very broadly, of which I would consider myself as one. The sources of the information for the cropping data are more directly presented in KWBA 115, if we cared to look at that, but we'll stay on.
Well, I want to understand this exhibit 119 because you testified about it. Are the numbers presented in this table generated by your application of the Python script?
Well, there's a significant amount of I want to be very careful by what you mean by the word generated. Could you please be more specific?
Yeah, I'll ask a simpler question. The numbers in this table, are they objective data or are they a product of some sort of analysis you prepared?
Well, I want to be clear that my written testimony and the supplemental materials in KWBA 104 very clearly state the methodology that was used to develop the table we're looking at. If we need to go through it in great detail, I'm happy to do so, but I think it's clearly in the record already.
And for the record, let me just interpose an objection. I would not be happy to do so. I think Mr. Becerra had all the time in the world yesterday to cross-examine Dr. Davids about.
I have no interest in getting into that level of detail.
That's what I'm gonna. I don't know where the objection. I suppose it is an objection. I'll overrule the objection. I think Mr. Becerra has a fair question here. Mr. Davids, I know it may be difficult and to summarize a response to that, but it is in general, I think, a yes or no question. And if we can frame the question properly. So if you think the question cannot be answered in the way Mr. Becerra has framed it, I would invite you to say that. But I'm trying to get to a yes or no answer.
Well, I think KWBA 105 would be a wonderful way of answering the question if we could.
Well, just I don't want to go beyond the scope of the redirect, which was specifically about this. Dr. Davids, is the cropping data shown in exhibit KWBA 119 objective data or data you generated through your analysis in some form?
It is objective data, and let me give you a very clear example of that. As we can see in 1885, alfalfa is stated to be 4,000 acres. That's a reference from William Hammond Hall of 4,000 acres. Again, there's some minor, potential discrepancies here. Is it 3,960 acres as georeferenced and calculated in GIS, or is it 4,000 acres? Okay, but 4,000 acres. And then in Grunsky, 1898, I don't remember the specific KWBA number, but that's Grunsky of 1898. You can see there's a reference to 20,000 acres. And so the way that these values were produced was, we have a historical reference from a map produced by William Hammond Hall of 4,000 acres in 1885. We have a reference to 20,000 acres from Grunsky in 1898. And in the absence of information between those two data points, what this procedure does that you're referring to is it linearly connects those two data points. And so you can see that 1886 is 5,231. 1887 is 6,462. If you were to take the difference between those values, it's exactly 1,231 additional acres for each year as you progress forward in time, such that by the time you arrive at 1898, you get to exactly 20,000 acres, which is the, I think as you phrased, the objective acreage reported by Grunsky, and 4,000 acres back in 1885, which is the objective acreage presented by
So let me
William Hammond Hall.
let me take a shot at summarizing what that means relative to the table. For alfalfa, the crop acres reflect some objective data points and a linear interpolation among those points where you didn't have objective data. Is that accurate?
Objection, Vegas to time.
Okay. Ms. Bowen, can we pull back out a little bit from this exhibit so we can see the whole data set? Okay, so Dr. Davids, do you recognize that this page, the time period is 1885 through 1944?
I do, yes.
So for the time period 1885 through 1944, is it accurate to characterize the alfalfa crop acres as some objective data points and a linear interpolation among those data points for the remainder of the column?
That is correct, and I will add that from 1931 through 1967, I believe it is, there were annual District Securities Commission reports that specified the exact acreage. So there were no linear interpolations for annual crop acreage from the period from 1931 through 1967 because of those District Securities Commission reports generated on an annual time step. Prior to that time period, there were less frequent references to cropped acreage, including Hall in 1885, Grunsky in 1898. I think there's the 1914 reference that's used for the 43,610 total cropped acres and so forth. But with the caveat that post 1931, the data that we're looking at has no interpolation post 1931, and prior to that, there are linear interpolations between known data points.
So the district securities reports, do you know whether those were the basis for the alfalfa crop yields used in table 3 of exhibit KWBA 20, which is Mr. Stanton's 1941 report? Do you need to see Mr. Stanton's report?
No, I think I'm familiar with what you're referring to. Could you rephrase your question, please?
Sure. You recall we've discussed in Mr. Stanton's report, there were a series of alfalfa crop yields from 1932 through 1940.
I do recall that, yes.
Do you know if those district securities reports were the source of that data?
I could not answer that question. Yeah, I do not know that.
Okay, could we please pull up exhibit KWBA 20? Ms. Mullen? Dr. Davids, you recognize this as table 1 from KWBA 20?
I do recognize that, yes.
Do you see at the top of the table, it says from annual reports to California District Securities Commission?
I do see that, yes.
So is it your understanding that those commission reports you just referenced are the objective source of data for the alfalfa crop yields reflected in this table 1?
Well, I think that that statement does appear to be in reference to all the contents of the table. But it's not clear if there were other, I guess it's not clear if there were potentially other sources of information, but from I think a plain reading of that, it does appear that the information in this table comes from the District Securities Commission reports.
And as we've discussed previously, you did not use the alfalfa crop yields from this table in preparing your regression analysis. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
Okay, can we please go back to exhibit KWBA 119? Ms. Mullen, thank you. And on redirect, Dr. Davids, you testified about the crop acreages in the 1930s being relatively low for alfalfa. Is that accurate?
Relative in the sense to the prior period, that is accurate, yes.
Did you include the period of the 1930s as part of your regression analysis in preparing a regression of alfalfa crop yields?
Objection, asked and answered.
Overruled.
Could you repeat the question, Mr. Becerra, please? Thank you.
Sure. In preparing your regression analysis involving alfalfa crop yields, did you include the period of the 1930s?
I mean, I agree that we've discussed this before, and the answer is no.
Can we please go to, Ms. Mullen, can we please go to exhibit KWBA 133? Dr. Davids, do you see that your red dash regression line includes the period of the 1930s?
Yes, I do.
Okay, thank you. Can we please pull up Dr. David's PowerPoint KWBA 148 and go to slide 27, please, Ms. Mullen? And Dr. Davids, do you see this page? Do you see it's a copy of exhibit KWBA 145?
Yes, I do.
And I believe you testified on redirect that you took information provided by Mr. Torres and passed it through what you call the credibility filter. Is that accurate?
I think that's an accurate recollection, yes.
Okay, and Mr. Torres's experience in operating Buena Vista system was all in what you've identified as period 4 on this slide. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. Do you see that both period 3 and period 4 include the Alejandro Canal?
I believe we discussed this yesterday, yes.
Okay, can we, Ms. Mullen, can we please go to slide 7 of Dr. David's PowerPoint? Do you see that, Dr. Davids?
I do.
Do you see the alignment of the Alejandro Canal on this slide?
And I'm going to object. I think we're getting beyond the scope of my direct examination here.
Where are you going, please, Mr. Becerra?
the Alejandro Canal has changed over time, and I want to understand to what extent Dr. Davids evaluated that change and relying on Mr. Torres's information.
Mr. Bivens, do you want to respond to that?
I had quite a limited scope of direct examination with respect to what Dr. Davids did with the information he received from Mr. Torres. And I think talking about the alignment of the Alejandro Canal, an exhibit that we didn't look at during the direct examination, goes well beyond that limited scope.
So I'm going to sustain the objection. Mr. Becerra, this is my understanding of the scope of the direct was that the redirect, excuse me, was that Mr. Bivens posed questions about the sources of data in that table. So I understand a proper scope would be questions about the sources of data. So if this question is related to that, I think we can go there, but I think you need to rephrase the question. Or tell us where we're going with respect to sources of data.
Yeah, I can explain if you like, if you want to do that, Ms. Kinsey. It would be most helpful to go back to the previous slide. I think it's 27. So, and I'm explaining at this point, not attempting to testify. The period 4 of the Alejandro Canal is in one form. That's the period Mr. Torres can testify to. In period 3, it's in a different form. Dr. Davids has testified he passed the information Mr. Torres gave him through a credibility filter in preparing his analysis. I just want to explore to what extent he understood the changes in the Alejandro Canal in applying that credibility filter.
And I just have to respond that Mr. Becerra explored this issue with the post-lining and pre-lining of the Alejandro Canal in some level of detail yesterday, and I don't think the scope of my redirect examination warrants yet another exploration.
Yeah, I'm going to sustain the objection. Mr. Becerra, if you want to ask, if you think it's important, Dr. Davids to testify about the source of information of the numbers that are listed here in this table, that's fine. Otherwise, let's move forward.
Yeah, I'll ask the one question. Dr. Davids, what was your source of information for stating here that estimated seepage from the Alejandro Canal pre-lining was 2,800 acre feet a year?
Well, I think as I very clearly articulated yesterday, I think the record will show that that was clearly not a value that Mr. Torres had direct experience with, because the entirety of his experience has been operating the Alejandro Canal as a lined canal. So of course he has no direct experience with the methodology that I discussed in terms of inflows and outflows from that conveyance facility. So what I discussed yesterday, do I need to summarize again, Ms. Kinsey, what I discussed yesterday?
No, you don't.
Okay.
Mr. Becerra, do you have a specific follow-up question?
Well, I guess my primary one is what it was his source of data for stating 2,800 acre feet of seepage from the Alejandro Canal.
That's fair. Now I recollect that we were focused on that question. So.
Yeah, but I did state that yesterday in my testimony. I can restate it, but again, I think it's.
Can you restate it for me, please, very briefly?
Okay. Yes. So the source of that information is for the channels that we do have that are still natural and unlined, that pass through similar geologic materials. Again, Mr. Torres did not do this. I did this myself. I inferred based on, and I talked about this yesterday, the channel geometry, the geologic materials that it's passing across, what an appropriate seepage estimate would be given those factors and given the known values that Mr. Torres was able to observe during the period that he was actually operating the system, as Mr. Becerra, correctly points out, which was in period 4.
And Ms. Kinsey, I have 2 additional questions.
All right, let's try them.
Dr. Davids, do you know whether the Alejandro Canal was realigned in approximately 1970?
I do. If we could go to KWBA or slide 7 and 8, we can actually see it on the screen for all of us to see, I believe.
All right, I'm going to note for the record that I believe we're going beyond the scope of redirect. I'm going to allow it because I want to hear the information. Okay, so Mr. Bivens, head nod to you. I realize this, but I'm going to allow it. Let's do this.
Fair enough.
So slide 7 shows the alignment of the Alejandro Canal. You can see that it actually used to come off from the same diversion point that the old or the main canal for the Buena Vista Water Storage District is diverted off of the river. You can see that from the red dot here in this 1946 aerial image that we're looking at. If you proceed to the next slide and keep an eye on that area, you can see that that point is actually shifted northward and eastward predominantly, such that it's near the present day location of what's called the Cross River Pipeline, which supplies water from the Kern River Canal to the Kern Water Bank main canal, which again I have labeled here as number 13. And the Alejandro Canal alignment, if you can see, was shifted eastward, and at that point was lined, and that's why Mr. Torres, had never operated that canal system without concrete lining. I consider the realignment to be a negligible issue in the scope of what we're discussing.
That's all I have, Ms. Kinsey.
Thank you, Mr. Becerra. On that note, Mr. Bivens, I think in fairness, given that we had a slight interlude that I'll admit was outside of your redirect, is there anything else, any redirect within that narrow scope about the Alejandro Canal that you would like to make?
No, Ms. Kinsey, I think we can call it a day for.
Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Thank you, Dr. Davids. I very much appreciate your time and attention and the many hours you've spent with us. Appreciate all your work. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Kinsey, for the very thoughtful leading us through these discussions. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I think next on my list is, what time is it? What I'd like to do, I'll tell the parties, I know we have pending motions with respect to Dr. David's testimony and associated exhibits. I think the most appropriate time for me to consider those will actually be after all of KWBA's, after the other two witnesses, Ms. Boisavane and Mr. Parker. It seemed to me in reviewing Mr. Parker's, I suspect that the issue of Dr. David's testimony may come up in on cross of Mr. Parker, so I thought it was appropriate to address all of those issues at the end when KWBA makes a motion to move their exhibits into evidence. But I did want to hear from you if you think that another approach would be either more efficient or more appropriate. Mr. Becerra, I see you are unmuted first, so I will turn to you first.
I think what you propose is just fine.
Okay. Mr. Bivens or Mr. O'Brien?
Ms. Kinsey, there is one other factor with respect to the outstanding motion. We do have Dr. Howes coming up as a witness for Buena Vista. He's with ITRC. If you have any inclination to delve deeper into this contract issue that was the subject of Mr. Becerra's questioning yesterday, I would certainly like to have the opportunity to question Dr. Howes about how it treats its contractual relationships with public entities in California that are subject to the Public Records Act. So I don't want to belabor this, but I think it's a legitimate line of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. That's helpful. So I'll keep that in mind when considering whether it makes sense to, at what point it makes sense to consider the outstanding motions, because
Ms.
we
Kinsey,
can't hold it. Yes, Mr. Becerra.
on that point, if we're going to get into cross-examining Dr. Howes about how the CSU system treats Public Records Act requests, we really should have CSU counsel in this hearing. It's not Buena Vista's, within Buena Vista's scope, and Dr. Howes is not an attorney.
Well, Mr. Becerra has brought the contract into this proceeding. I don't know how he can have it both ways. He's questioned Dr. Davids extensively about that contract. I think I'm entitled to ask the originator of the contract, Dr. Howes, how they deal with this in terms of custom and practice. That doesn't require Cal State counsel to come in. I do agree. I'm sorry, one final point, Ms. Kinsey.
Sure.
I do agree with the point you made yesterday that this whole set of issues surrounding this contract is really not an appropriate issue for the AHO. It's if ITRC thinks it has a cause of action against anyone for breach of contract, that's an issue for the superior courts to deal with, not the AHO.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien, and Mr. Becerra as well. I think your comments are both well taken and noted. I'm not going to resolve either of those now because this may not come up. So what I'd like to do is move forward, not now. I think we should take a lunch break, but we will move forward with KWBA's witnesses and then return to this issue after we've heard from both of those witnesses.
I do have one further matter to discuss
Yes,
before we
please.
get to cross. My perception, at least, of Ms. Spoletta's cross-examination questions is suggested to me that Rosedale is rather sympathetic to these witnesses. I don't want to have to do cross-examination on top of what Ms. Spoletta does. So I'd like to understand her perspective. I know this gets pretty tricky in state board hearings sometimes with cross on cross. So it would be more efficient, I think, if Rosedale would go first in cross-examining point of Water Bank's remaining witnesses.
Ms. Spoletta, do you have any comment or objection to that approach?
I didn't hear what Mr. Becerra said.
Fair enough.
He wants me to do what?
Mr. Becerra, I'll turn to you.
I think it would be most appropriate if Rosedale were the first party to cross-examine the remainder of the Water Bank's witnesses.
I have no objection to that.
Thank you, Ms. Spoletta.
Thank you. I don't either. And I'm sorry, Spoletta, I know we called you out of the blue. So
No problem.
The nature of these Zoom hearings, it lends to efficiency sometimes, but it's not quite the same as being in the room. Are there any other matters we need to address before we break for lunch?
Ms. Kinsey, this is Peter Keel for Tulare Lake Basin. Regards to Mr. Becerra's request to Ms. Spoletta, I anticipate having a very few brief questions for Ms. Boissevain. If you would like me to proceed your questioning, I'm happy to do so as well.
Are you proposing the very few questions that you're proposing that you would maybe ask those questions immediately after Ms. Spoletta?
I'm willing to do so.
Okay. Mr. Becerra or anyone else, do you have any concerns with that? Okay.
Just fine with me.
All right.
Thank you, Mr.
Good.
Keel.
Thank you. Anything else? I have that it is exactly noon, so we'll break for lunch and return at 1 p.m. Please do log out of your Zoom and log back in, and I will see all of you in an hour.